For centuries, men have battled the ice and the dangers of northern waters in quest of new lands, new treasures. 1,000 years ago, the Viking, Ravnafloki, guided by 3 sacred ravens, sailed from Norway into the unknown seas off Europe and found Iceland. A generation later, Eric the Red forsook a Norse colony on Iceland, sailed still further west, and settled on Greenland. "400 years ago, Davis searched northward up the mighty strait that bears his name. By his time, the fancied wealth of China was the deadly lure that drew explorers into the ice. Barents, the Dutchman, searching for a northeast passage to Cathay, found Spitsbergen, and soon its whalebone and furs were adorning half the fashionable ladies of Europe. Hudson found his strait, and Baffin his bay, in the relentless search for a northwest way to China. And in the 18th century, Peter the Great set in motion a fantastic enterprise, the Russian Great Northern Expedition. Hundreds died, but the coastline of Siberia was mapped as far as Great Bear Cape. It took most of the 19th century for the persistent British to fill in the blank spaces southwest of Greenland. Finally, with the 20th century, the last frozen fortresses yielded to Nansen, Sverdrup, Amundsen, Peary, and Stephenson. Today, the outlines of the Polar Sea are known, but the price in suffering has been high. The latter-day explorers had an enemy fiercer than any demon which inhabited the ancient Mediterranean. They faced the great, churning ice pack of the Arctic. These cruel, uncharted waters demanded the utmost in discipline and sacrifice from their would-be conquerors. Listen to their stories, taken from ancient logbooks and journals.
To those who have not seen a northern ocean in winter, the term ice conveys no idea of what it is the fate of an Arctic navigator to witness. Let them remember that ice is stone, a floating rock in the stream. Then let them imagine, if they can, these mountains of crystal meeting as mountains in motion would meet, with a noise like thunder.
Early on Sunday morning, a little after 4, the groaning of beams and the creaking of timbers drove the crew out onto the ice in rather unprepared garb. No time at all was afforded to save anything. In about 15 minutes, much to the astonishment of all, the vessel was completely destroyed.
It is now important to remark on another subject. Of the 3 compasses we had, all ceased to traverse at about the same time, and we were consequently obliged to shape our courses by means of astronomical bearings. When the weather became thick, this made proceeding at all extremely difficult.
In the spring, this region is so beset with fogs that he who travels every day is half the time in doubt as to where he is going, and never knows whether he is headed inland or out to sea until he finds himself floundering among the hummocks of the offshore pack.
The ground on which we stand is dearly paid for. Its exploration has cost the life of many a brave man of iron will. Still, for each one who fell, there were others who offered to take his place. Thus our knowledge of the regions of the earth moves further and further north.
Quebec City, 1922. A Canadian government ship is about to leave on the first regular annual patrol of the Arctic archipelago. The steamer was commanded by Captain Joseph Elzéar Bernier, distinguished master mariner who had been almost 60 years at sea, all around the world. Besides her experienced crew, she carried officials of the Department of the Interior, an RCMP detachment under Inspector C.E. Wilcox, and an official photographer, George H. Valiquette. In Davis Strait, the great bergs sailed smoothly past them southwards, warning of the ice pack which lay ahead. Maintenance of a detailed record of weather observations is a special point of pride with Arctic expeditions, each of whom has profited by the similar efforts of their predecessors. The first objective was to establish an RCMP post at Pond Inlet on the north shore of Baffin Island. But on arrival there, ice conditions precluded any successful landing operations. And so the course was shaped northwards to Ellesmere, the top of the Arctic. Here, a suitable inlet was found and named Craig Harbor, in honor of the officer in overall charge, J.D. Craig. A feverish period of round-the-clock work followed. 2 years' supplies for 7 men had to be offloaded. In the meantime, ground surveys of the area went forward, and local recreational facilities were put into use. Soon, living quarters and a storehouse were nearly completed. But after 8 days, menacing ice in the bay forced the ship to pull out. So, picking up the last mail and saying farewell, the Arctic sailed at midnight. However, man's insatiable thirst for conquest had to go on, and the aircraft was brought in to fathom the mysteries of the frozen unknown. In 1930, Major L.F. Burwash set off to fly over the area, whose influence rendered every compass useless in the Arctic, the North Magnetic Pole. The pole, it was known, wandered a bit, but it had been generally situated on Boothia Peninsula. Burwash hoped to position it from the air. With Walter Gilbert, one of the first of the bush flyers to push off into the high north, he set off from Peterson Bay. A ship or a sled can generally stop when lost, but an aircraft must always keep going, somewhere. The Arctic landscape gives you few clues, even when you can see it, and often you can't see it. Another northern treachery, the sudden Arctic fog. After hours of flying, Gilbert knew that unless they could get underneath it, they dare go no further north. What was their position? Could they go down through the fog without running into a mountain? But Burwash recognized that by this time they had reached the magnetic pole and could turn back. This was the very country in which the famous explorer Sir John Franklin had been lost. And at Victory Point on King William's Island, Burwash found a cairn. Down this shore, the desperate crew had struggled. One by one, they had dropped and died. And for nearly 100 years, expeditions had searched for their remains. It was less than a century ago, and now Burwash could fly home in hours from Victory Point. But the remaining problems were still great, and the farther north you went, the greater they became. Admiral Byrd learned this when he navigated the first aircraft over the North Pole. It was a long flight for the aircraft of those days, and over empty and unmapped country. It was a greater challenge than flying the oceans had been. Up here, you could easily lose track of your position and also be helpless to determine in which direction you were headed. No magnetic compass could help. Byrd on this trip used something new, a sun compass. It got him there, and it got him back. But it meant continuous celestial calculations throughout the 15 hours of the trip. Leaving Vancouver in 1940, a Canadian ship on patrol and supply duties in the archipelago scored another first, the Northwest Passage from west to east. The crew of the RCMP schooner St. Roch was commanded by Sergeant, now Superintendent, Henry Larson. The schooner began to approach the North Magnetic Pole, and increasingly her compass spun uselessly in its mountings. An alert lookout at all times was absolutely vital, not only because of floe ice, but also to spot shoals and reefs, which were numerous in the nearby uncharted waters. The hand lead line was busy 24 hours a day. With 5,000 miles of her voyage completed, the skipper chose Walker Bay on the west coast of Victoria Island as the first winter quarters. The hull was allowed to freeze into the ice. A wooden framework was constructed over the deck and covered with canvas. Insulated with banked snow, the St. Roch now became snug winter quarters. The ship spent 2 such winters in the ice on her way across. During the second one, Constable Chartrand died of a heart attack at Paisley Bay, Boothia Peninsula. Father Henry came over 800 miles from his mission to perform the burial. A cairn with nameplate marks his resting place, one of the company of many brave men whose stony graves are scattered throughout the Arctic. At last, St. Roch neared Lunenburg. In the tradition of the explorers, she had fought her way through. Now, in 1942, the future greeted her at the end of her triumphant journey. The patrol aircraft and radar of wartime, brought into use, were soon to revolutionize Arctic navigation. Other aids to air navigation followed. Runways were built, and maintenance crews took up residence on the barren islands. At last, large aircraft appeared on regular schedules throughout the high Arctic. The first airport had been surveyed in 1920, and few then had believed it would ever be used. "35 years later, a pattern of landing strips and weather stations dotted the enormous emptiness. Many other problems remained, but nobody doubted they could be met. The aircraft's contribution is vital, but it will never be economic to maintain the Arctic entirely from the air. Cargoes up into the hundreds of thousands of tons require that heavy transport must be able to move in, move out, and move under the surface of the sea. So the Royal Canadian Navy took a lead. Owing to the lack of adequate marine navigational charts in the Canadian archipelago, they sent a specially built vessel on a long trial voyage north. And in 1959, another special Canadian ship was making charts off the coast of Baffin Island using a variety of modern equipment. Even with today's helicopters, the job has its difficulties and dangers. By the end of one day, the amount of charting done by Baffin's crew, along with the mapping surveys of her shore parties, exceeded the result of weeks of effort in the past. But what of the development of our northern areas? In Montreal, Michael Marston of the Arctic Institute of North America considers the future.
One of our great hopes at this very time is the development of oil in the Arctic islands. We are hoping that we may find oil somewhere along through these islands. If we do find that oil, we're going to produce oil in an area which is much nearer to Japan and to Russia and to Britain, to Germany, than it is to our own producing centers in Canada. And therefore the logical thing would seem to be to get that oil and send it off to other countries as a direct export. And the big blockage is this. Sitting right here in the pack is this impassable area for ships. We cannot get through this thing. We've tried for centuries now, and we cannot move through this area. The answer to that one could be the freighter submarine. An atomic-powered freighter submarine can travel enormous distances underwater, and it can carry cargoes of 20,000 and 30,000 tons at much higher speeds than the conventional ships that we're using on the open oceans of the world today. Such vessels could travel through the Arctic basin and link the major production areas of the world. But they could also use another device which is called the inertial computer. This device is a navigation aid which will take a vessel with absolute pinpoint accuracy to any chosen point on the Earth. And it doesn't have to have any reference whatever to the outside world. Accordingly, you could take an atomic submarine and dive beneath the ice pack and navigate to oil wells on the floor of the ocean. You could load your submarine with 30,000 tons of fuel at a time direct from the well and take it by the shortest, fastest possible method to the consumers around the world. If we can only employ our imagination now, develop the techniques that we're beginning to get a hold of, the next 10 years could very easily see the culminating achievement of centuries of effort in Arctic navigation.
Our ability to navigate in the north increases yearly, but a good deal of development and mapping still remains to be done. And as the Canadian government ship, d'Iberville, slips down the St. Lawrence heading north, she still proceeds with due caution, for she sails to meet an ancient foe of mariners, still dangerous and deceptive today, the powerful, implacable ice pack of the Arctic.